The 80s, a time when the drinks were as wild as the fads that sprung from that iconic decade. A decade we'll be taking a trip into on today's video, as we'll be talking about our go-to drinks when we wanted to kick it with our pals after a long day of work. And to start with, we have Meisterbräu. Today we see a lot of beers with fewer calories called light beers, but did you know that they've been around since the 1960s? Back in 1967, there was a clever biochemist named Dr. Joseph L. Owades who worked for Rheingold Brewing Company. He came up with a way to make beer with less starch, which meant it had fewer calories and carbs, but still kept the alcohol and flavor we love. You see, back then, people were becoming more interested in products with fewer calories, like diet sodas, and Meisterbräu Lite was right in line with that. They even tried making other healthy foods to go with it in a line called Lite Food Products, but sadly, they were a bit too ambitious and it didn't work out. The whole brewery had to close down, but don't worry, there's more to the story. In 1972, the Miller Brewing Company came along and bought the recipe for Meisterbräu Lite. They spent a lot of time tweaking and improving it, and then they introduced it with a brand new name, Miller Lite. And that's how we got the light beer we know today. Olympia Beer. In the United States, people have always loved light, smooth, and easy drinking lager-type beers. But what's interesting is that different parts of the country had their own favorite beers. In places like Washington State and nearby areas, there was a beer called Olympia Beer that was really popular for most of the 20th century. A man named Leopold Friedrich Schmidt, who came all the way from Germany, started a brewery in 1896 in Tumwater, Washington, which is close to the state capital, Olympia. They were famous by saying, "It's the water," in their advertising, and that meant they used very special, carefully treated water to make their flagship beer taste just right. They kept making beer in Tumwater all the way until 2003, when the Pabst Brewing Company took over Olympia Beer and moved its production to California. But here's the sad part. In January 2021, Pabst Brewing Company decided to stop making Olympia Beer altogether. So even though it was a big favorite for a long time, it's no longer around. Times change, and so do the beers we love. Peter's Wicked Ale. Oh, let me tell you about something special called craft beer. These are the beers made by small local companies with lots of love and care, and they don't make as much as the big companies. Craft beers come in all sorts of flavors, and they can be pretty strong in alcohol content. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this whole craft beer thing really took off thanks to beers like Pete's Wicked Ale. Now, Pete Schlossberg, who lived in Norwich, Connecticut, was a pioneer in the craft beer world. He used to make wine at home, but in 1979, he decided to switch to making beer because it was quicker. It took him 7 years of perfecting his craft, but in the end, he introduced the world to Pete's Wicked Ale. This beer was thick, strong, and full of flavor, and it was actually the very first American brown ale in history. It was quite different from the light American-style lagers like Miller Lite and Budweiser. After a while, Pete decided to sell his beer company to the Gambrinus Company in 1998, but here's the twist. Just 2 years later, they decided to change the taste of Pete's Wicked Ale to make it lighter, and in 2011, they sent a letter to the people who sell their beer saying they wouldn't make Pete's Wicked Ale anymore because not many people were buying it. So that's how a really influential beer said its final goodbye. Times change, and so do the flavors people love. Bud Dry. During the late 80s in Japan, something called dry beer became incredibly popular. Brands like Asahi Dry were made a bit like how they would make dry wines. You know how yeast helps turn sugars and starches into alcohol when making beer, right? Well, in dry beers, they use a lot of extra yeast, so it eats up almost all the sugars. This makes the beer not taste sweet at all and leaves hardly any aftertaste on your tongue. Now in 1989, a big American beer company called Anheuser-Busch introduced their own dry beer called Bud Dry. It was like a cousin to their Budweiser and Bud Light beers. Bud Dry had a few more calories than Bud Light, but still had a pretty high alcohol content like Budweiser. They really tried to make Bud Dry famous with lots of funny commercials on TV. These commercials showed people drinking the beer and asking strange questions like puzzles with no answers. It led to a slogan, "Why ask why? Try Bud Dry." People were curious, so Bud Dry sold pretty well for a while, even though the ads didn't really explain what made it so different. But, over time, fewer and fewer folks wanted Bud Dry, and by 2006, Anheuser-Busch started to say goodbye to it. They stopped making it altogether in 2010. Sometimes, even with all the marketing in the world, a beer just can't stick around forever. Times change, and so do the beers we enjoy. The joy of opening up a cold one can make you feel great, right? Another gesture that brings old Marshall here is a smile when I see you guys subscribing to the channel. So what do you say you make my day? While you ponder on that, let me get back to the next brand, and that is Billy Beer. Oh, you're gonna love this. Let me start by telling you a fun story from the past about Jimmy Carter and his brother Billy. You see, back in 1976, when Jimmy was running for president, his brother Billy became quite famous. Billy was a friendly, down-to-earth guy who owned a gas station and loved to drink beer. Now, there was an old brewery in Louisville, Kentucky called Fall City Brewery. In 1977, it was in big trouble and about to go out of business, so they had a clever idea. They asked Billy Carter to put his name on a new beer that they would be making and call it Billy Beer. They even gave him $50,000 to do it, and he helped promote the beer. They put his signature and quote from him on the beer can, saying it was the best beer he ever tasted. But here's the twist. Even though people were curious and bought Billy Beer at first, it didn't taste as good as everyone had hoped, and sometimes Billy would drink too much at public events and say he really didn't like his own beer that much, and, well, that didn't help. So even though it got a lot of attention, Billy Beer couldn't save Fall City Brewery. It had to close down just a year later in 1978. Sometimes even when a famous name is on a product, it's not enough to make it a success. That's just how things go sometimes. Henry Weinhardt's Private Reserve, Portland, a state known as one of the finest beer cities in America. You see, the love for beer in this city goes way back, almost as far back as the city itself. Back in 1856, a man named Henry Weinhardt set up his brewery there just 5 years after Portland was founded. According to Oregon Public Broadcasting, Henry Weinhardt was quite the pioneer in brewing. In 1976, a company called Blitz Weinhardt, which was connected to Henry Weinhardt, started making a special beer called Henry Weinhardt's Private Reserve. It was a light, tasty lager with the Bavarian style, and people in the Pacific Northwest loved it. It became really popular for a long time. But times change, and in 1999, Blitz Weinhardt had to close down. Eventually, their brand became part of a big company called Molson Coors. Then in August 2021, Molson Coors decided to stop making some of their beers because they wanted to focus on fancier beers and hard seltzers. Sadly, one of the beers they chose to stop making was Henry Weinhardt's Private Reserve. So even though it had been a beloved beer for many years, it's not around anymore. Sometimes companies have to make tough decisions about what they want to keep making. That's just how things go in the world of beer. Red, white, and blue. Let me take you back in time to the year 1899 when something called red, white, and blue beer was introduced by the Pabst Brewing Company. They released it in July, just in time for Independence Day. The name was all about celebrating patriotism, and that was a big deal. But what really made Red, White, and Blue so special was how affordable it was. It was a light, crisp lager that was easy to drink because it didn't have too much alcohol, just 3.2%. You could even get a six-pack for as little as 89 cents back in the 1970s. It was so cheap that a bar in Milwaukee called the Appliance used it for a fun thing called a naked beer slide in the 1980s. Can you imagine that? However, as the years went by, Red, White, and Blue kind of faded away and Pabst stopped making it in the big quantities. But in July 2018, the Pabst Milwaukee Brewery and Tap Room brought it back. They had a big party and put it on tap for everyone to enjoy. Sadly, it didn't last long because the tap room closed down in 2020, and that's when Red, White, and Blue said its final goodbye. Sometimes old beer brands come back for a little while and then they disappear again just as quickly. That's how the story goes in the world of beer. Krueger's. Nowadays, we take it for granted that we can find beer in cans everywhere, but a long time ago, someone had to come up with the idea, and that someone was the Gottfried Krueger Brewing Company. Back in the day, in 1909, the American Can Company tried to put beer in cans, but they had a problem. The cans couldn't handle the pressure from the carbonation, and they kept exploding. It took them until 1933 to figure out a way to make that can work. Finally, they had a working model, and they showed it to Krueger, an old brewery that had been around for nearly a century. In 1935, Krueger did something amazing. They put two of their beers, Krueger's Cream Ale and Krueger's Finest Beer, into those new cans and started selling them in Richmond, Virginia. People loved it. Within just a few months, Krueger was canning 180,000 beers every single day. By the end of 1935, 37 more breweries decided to use cans too. But even though they made history and were really innovative, Krueger didn't last forever. By 1961, the company was having a tough time and another beer maker called Narragansett took over. They slowly stopped making Krueger's products, and that's how a pioneer in beer cans came to an end. Sometimes even the most creative ideas can't keep a company going forever. That's just how the business world works. Hop and Gator. Now, this is a quirky one. You might think the name sounds like an alligator leaping through the air, but it actually tells you exactly what's in the drink. You see, hop in the name refers to the hops, those special plants that give beer its unique bitter taste and flavor. And Gator comes from Gatorade. The clever mind behind Gatorade, a man named Robert Cade, also came up with Hop and Gator. They started making it in 1969, and it was distributed through the Pittsburgh Brewing Company. What's really interesting, though, is how they described Hop and Gator. On the one hand, they called it a beer, and the cans even said lemon lime lager. But on the other hand, they said it was a new alcoholic beverage, which made it a bit confusing for folks. Now, the most notable thing about Hop and Gator was its strength. It had 25% more alcohol than the average beer back then. But even with that extra kick, people didn't really go for it. There were some business problems, and they even tried calling it a malt beverage, but that didn't help. Pittsburgh Brewing had to stop making Hop and Gator in 1975. Sometimes, even when you mix two things, it doesn't always work out as planned. That's just how it goes in the world of drinks. Miller Clear. Going back to the early 1990s when something unusual was happening in the world of drinks, you see, back then, some companies wanted to make clear beverages really popular. They thought that clear meant pure and good, so they tried making clear versions of everything from soft drinks like Crystal Pepsi and Tab Clear to alcohol like Zima. Now, in 1993, the Miller Brewing Company decided to join in on this trend and introduce something called Miller Clear. They said it was because people wanted a beer with lots of flavor but not too heavy. Miller Clear had 122 calories in each serving, which was between regular beer and light beer. But you know what? Miller had a tough time getting people to like Miller Clear. So, you see, when it comes to beer, the more golden it looks, the more people usually think it tastes good. Plus, they used an unusual process to make Miller Clear. They used activated charcoal to take away the color and a lot of the taste from the beer, which was kind of odd. Just like all those other clear drinks, Miller Clear didn't stick around for long. By the mid-1990s, it had pretty much disappeared from the market. Sometimes, even when you try to do something different with drinks, it doesn't always work out. That's just how it goes in the world of beverages. And there you have it. Shall we toast to you and me making it to the end of this video? So which one of these brought you some fond memories? Let's chat about it in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. That's all, folks. We'll see you in the next one.